Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. If there is one game on here that you have probably realised that I like by now, it is most likely Street Fighter 2. It is impossible to talk fighting game history without mentioning this game. The game was influential in so many ways and was popular the world over. There is no doubt at this stage that this was one of the most impactful releases of all time. The game managed to hit all of the right notes. Everything about the title was just so appealing. In today's content we are going to be looking at one of the many spin-offs related to this famous game. Pocket Fighter was a title that took the characters found in Street Fighter along with some other Capcom fighting games and presented them in a fighting environment in all new ways. As you can see, characters in this entry look extremely different to how they were represented in the fighting game that was successful the world over. In this content we are going to be looking at this game in detail, discussing the gameplay it offers, and most importantly why Capcom chose to take such a different art direction with the franchise to what had already proven to print money in the past. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Pocket Fighter. The Street Fighter game that was way too Japanese. Yeah. After the smash hit success of Street Fighter 2, as you will probably be aware, Capcom would do everything in their power to capitalise off of their momentum and continue to make as much money off of their franchise as possible. Rather than chronologically releasing a new Street Fighter game every few years, instead the Japanese company used other strategies to make quick cash. This would include every year releasing enhanced versions of the game, until we got Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. But Street Fighter content would not end here. By 1995 we had a live action Street Fighter movie and even multiple video game releases based on the film. That year would too birth the Street Fighter Alpha series. Capcom System 2 board games that story-wise would occur halfway between the events of Street Fighter 2 and the original 1987 game. By 1996 there was even more Street Fighter content available. We got the amazing tag team crossover game X-Men vs Street Fighter that would result in another sub-series of its own games. And we got Street Fighter EX, which would be the birth of polygon-based Street Fighter games. That same year Street Fighter 3 was being hyped too. The game that Street Fighter enthusiasts originally wanted in the first bloody place. Now, if we want to go even more obscure, on top of all of this we also had further nonsense available to consumers, including the title released for the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation exclusively in Japan, known as Street Fighter 2 The Interactive Movie, a bloody FMV game based off of the Street Fighter 2 animated film. If you wanted Street Fighter content in the mid-90s, Capcom had us more than covered. This brings us round to 1997 and an oddity known as Pocket Fighter. Before we dig deeper discussing this subject, instantly the most noticeable feature regarding this game is obviously the graphics. They look vastly different to what is present in Street Fighter 2 and lack the gritty appeal that helped the franchise take pop culture by storm. The art style present in the classic game was truly suitable for everyone. It was bright and colourful so it would catch the eye of all age groups, and the fighting in the game was intuitive enough to be suitable for players of all ages and abilities. The game offered enough flexibility for experienced adults to take part in strategic combat, whilst very young children could find a similar level of entertainment through simply button bashing the intuitive controls. Even in the very early 90s I was a huge fan of the game, and I was only 6 years old by that point. Whenever I got the chance, I would play the game on my uncle's Super Nintendo at home, and on weekends I got to play the title on an arcade cabinet in my auntie's pub. Street Fighter 2 fever had swept the land, and both myself and my younger brother even had Street Fighter 2 branded children's t-shirts, which were obviously available for my mother to buy on the high street. Why do I bring all of this up, you may ask? Because according to my research, one of the reasons Pocket Fighter exists is because apparently they wanted a Street Fighter game in their menagerie that was suitable for children. Which, if true, absolutely blows my mind, as Street Fighter 2 was pretty much the game that solidified me as a gamer in my young childhood, moving gaming in my life from a casual interest on my Amstrad CPC to something I took part in every day. So it blows my mind that Capcom thought that children would prefer this to this, when Street Fighter is a fighting game. By 1997, the year Pocket Fighter was released, kids franchises such as the Ninja Turtles, the Power Rangers, Transformers and He-Man had all proven popular the world over at different times. So the release of Pocket Fighter seems even more bizarre to me, as what sort of child would want their favourite fighters to look, well, wimpier, I guess. Speaking of the marketing towards children, at one point in Pocket Fighter's development it was planned to be released under the title of Street Fighter Kids, but would be changed at a later date. The art style phenomenon present in this game bizarrely is not unique to just the Street Fighter franchise, and ridiculously Virtua Fighter would receive the same treatment with the release of Virtua Fighter Kids. In fact, Capcom would choose to butcher many of its other franchises with this art style too, including with the release of Mighty Final Fight on the Famicom and Mega Man Powered Up on the PlayStation Portable. The Japanese company loved applying this cutesy art style to their biggest IPs. This bizarre practice of deforming characters in Japan is actually very common. So common in fact, the practice even has its own slang term, known as chibi. The main elements associated with this art style are big heads, small bodies and wide eyes, basically to try and make characters as cute looking as possible. Well-known characters from Japanese anime and manga are often portrayed in this alternative way. Like the rest of the world, sci-fi saw a huge spike in popularity in Japan in the late 70s and early 80s. In Japan's case with the rise of many sci-fi animes, such as Mobile Suit Gundam. Fandoms developed around these franchises, leading to a range of fan art, most notably chibi depictions. Magazines would even publish a lot of chibi parody manga, for Space Battleship Yamato for example. Sci-fi and comedy in Japan would slowly blend further and further together. Dragon Ball creator Akira Toriyama for example would even design mini Godzillas and mini Ultramans, which inspired a student named Koji Yokoi to use the same art style to draw mini Gundams, which he submitted as fan art to the Bandai Gundam fan magazine. The editor loved the illustrations so much that the magazine gave Yokoi's Gundams their own recurring manga in the magazine. In 1984, these illustrations would catch the eye of Bandai's toy department, and the young student was invited to join the company to design capsule toys based on his chibi design. Since Gundam, like the Transformers for example, was a rough and tough franchise, internally within Bandai not everyone was initially on board with such a product. The subject was rather divisive, as many people felt that making these tough looking robots look more cute made no sense, and it compromised the integrity of the franchise. In the end though, Koji Yokoi's designs would win out, leading to the launch of the SD Gundam World line of toys, which would prove extremely popular. I guess as a Westerner looking in at this art style, or even as a Japanese businessman in the 80s, making such characters cute does seem to be odd. However, upon doing further research today, it seems to be just as much about comedic value as it is about trying to make characters look adorable. I guess thinking about it, the concept of making a fighting robot or warrior as cute as possible is quite absurd and could easily be seen as funny if given the right context. Either way, all of this makes a little more sense digging into the history of chibi art. It is all certainly a little more layered and nuanced than let's make these characters look more kid friendly. In the world of video games and the original chibification of the Street Fighter lineup, the first time the world would see the roster portrayed this way in a game was with the release of Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, which appeared in the arcades, on the Sony PlayStation, the Sega Saturn and later more platforms. In regards to this sort of character portrayal being considered a sort of parody art style in Japan, this is further echoed by the game's ridiculous title itself, which pokes fun at the name of the latest installment in the Street Fighter 2 series, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. However, the game draws elements from both Street Fighter Alpha and Darkstalkers as well as just Street Fighter 2, rather than being a fighting game. As you can see, this game is actually from a different genre altogether, so instead functions as a puzzle game. The gameplay shares many common themes with other titles from the medium, such as Sega's Baku Baku Animal, or Capcom's own Panikis, which involves players controlling pairs of blocks that fall into a pit-like playfield. In Puzzle Fighter, blocks are switched out for gems and can only be eliminated by coming into contact with a crash gem of the same colour. Good players can set up huge chain reactions, eliminating multiple gems simultaneously, causing counter gems to drop into opponents' playfields. There are obviously further rules that mix up the gameplay more, but what I have just explained to you gives you the basic gist of how Puzzle Fighter plays. You would probably have noticed that the chain reactions and counter moves in this game are very similar to those found in the Puyo Puyo series. This, however, was no coincidence, as shortly before the release of Puzzle Fighter, Puyo Puyo 2 was sweeping the Japanese arcade gaming scene, generating a ton of money. So Capcom decided they wanted a slice of that pie for themselves. When it came to Capcom releasing a puzzle game to call their own, they would use characters from Street Fighter 2 to help promote the game. After all, Street Fighter 2 was the most popular arcade game of the 90s, so would instantly give any project more clout. When it comes to the puzzle game genre, it is well known to be a gaming genre that attracts a higher than average female demographic. So the chibification of the Street Fighter lineup for this game would have made perfect sense, as any suit-wearing 90s Japanese businessman would know that all women apparently love anything cute. In fact, making puzzle games cuter to further reach a female demographic was not exclusive to just Puzzle Fighter either. Puyo Puyo on the Super Nintendo in Europe would be rebranded as Kirby's Ghost Trap, and would be sold and marketed around the lovable pink Eater of Worlds. In Japan though, when it comes to Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo's marketing, the marrying of these elements would pan out exactly how Capcom had intended, as this simple puzzle game would be one of Japan's most popular arcade games of 1996, ludicrously even outperforming Tekken 2 in that country, a game in the West that would go on to become one of the most popular arcade games of its time. So now that these cute characters had appeared in an extremely successful game of their own, they would soon get a fighting game to call their own. Pocket Fighter, known as Super Gem Fighter Minimix in the West, is a fighting game that is a spin-off of a puzzle game that was a parody spin-off of a fighting game, ultimately resulting in a slightly new take on the fighting game genre. Pocket Fighter, that would first appear in the arcades on Capcom System 2 hardware, like Puzzle Fighter, would feature a roster of characters who appeared in Street Fighter 2 and Street Fighter Alpha, and the Darkstalkers series. But since this was made in 1997, we would get characters included from Capcom System 3 board games, such as Street Fighter 3 and even Red Earth. Characters from other Capcom games are also scattered throughout the backgrounds of this title. Thinking about it, they should have just called this game Capcom vs Capcom. We will touch more on the characters shortly, but first let's talk gameplay mechanics. At its heart, Pocket Fighter is your standard Capcom fighting affair, but aside from the artistic differences between this game and most of their other fighters, there are further differences too. Basically, there are various gems that are similar to the ones seen in Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo. These can be collected by players during matches to power up their characters so that they can level up and become more powerful in combat, much like in Red Earth, which we have also covered in depth on here before. The game also has a feature known as elemental orbs, which can be thrown to the opponents in a variety of angles in a technique that is visually based on elemental hits from Darkstalkers. Elemental orbs allow players to affect opponents in a variety of different ways, such as freezing them or turning them to stone, for example. Also, throughout play, treasure chests appear on the battlefield, along with item carriers. These contain an assortment of different items, from gems to food that restore fighters' health. You will probably notice the presence of bars on the screen too. At the very top of the screen, like most fighting games, there is a life bar, but underneath a super bar is also present, which when filled allows players to perform mighty combos. A number is also located next to the super bar that indicates how many times the bar has been filled, allowing the player to stock the bar up to 9 times if desired. Different mighty combos require a different amount of stock to be performed. Now, to make matters a little more complicated, the game also features 3 sub-bars at the bottom of the screen. These function as the game's gem gauges, which when filled allows players to perform special moves rather than combos. Basically, each time an attack connects to an opponent, gems pop out of him or her, which can be then taken to level up the corresponding special moves for additional effect. There is also some additional crossover between these multiple gauges. For example, a technique known as a Mega Crush can be performed, which costs 1 stock of the Mighty Combo gauge and empties the gem gauge simultaneously. When performing such a move, all of the collected gems shoot out of your character and damage the enemy. In terms of controls, Pocket Fighter features a simple 4-button layout consisting of a punch button, a kick button, a special button and a taunt button. With regards to the special button, it is used to perform the powerful moves that are chargeable with the use of the gem gauge. These moves cannot be blocked and upon impact drop gems in the opponent's possession for added humour. The more these special moves are charged up, the more gems will be dropped. The game also includes a ridiculous feature known as a costume combo, which when performed will cause a character to change into various costumes during the sequence. These costumes range from uniforms such as traffic cops or schoolgirls to swimsuits, and even cosplays of other Capcom characters. For example, Chun-Li may turn into her version of Jill from Resident Evil. Speaking of characters and the game's roster in general, you will notice that this is perhaps the most female-heavy roster ever seen in a Capcom fighting game, which probably feeds back to that cute factor present in the game along with the title's relationship with Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, a game that was heavily marketed towards young girls. Out of the 10 characters that are immediately selectable, only 3 of them are male, with those being Ryu, Ken and Zangief. In regards to the female characters included in the game, once again I would say they definitely were chosen with the Japanese market in mind. For starters, despite featuring a heavily female roster, the game does not include Cammy, a character they will push hard in the West, so much so that her character played by Kylie Minogue in the live action movie would be promoted much more prominently than the actress who played Chun-Li. But as you can see, they did not even bother to put Cammy in Pocket Fighter. As mentioned on here before, the Japanese seem to really love Sakura, so instead she would get a roster spot along with the likes of Chun-Li and even the very Eastern themed character known as Ibuki. Morrigan, Felicia and Husenko from the Darkstalkers franchise would all be included too, along with Tessa from Red Earth. The game would also include 2 secret characters such as Akuma, who often appeared in Capcom games as an unlockable or secret boss, and finally Dan, the fighter who parodies the 2 stars of the art of fighting, who is obviously a perfect fit for a Capcom game themed around parody. So now we have discussed why this game exists and what it has to offer. Now let's take a look at how the West felt about this game on release. GameSpot would probably highlight the general consensus and confusing feeling around this game on release better than anyone else when they wrote, "Okay, let's see if I can explain this without losing my mind. Capcom took characters from its various fighting games and put them in a puzzle game called Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo. The game was at its core a Puyo Puyo clone, except little super deformed versions of Street Fighters fought it out in the middle of the screen. This was done purely for effect, as their fighting didn't really impact the gameplay at all. Now Capcom have taken the midget fighters out of the puzzle game and put them back into a fighting game. The gems from Puzzle Fighter show up as well. The result is a fighting game that is so sickeningly basic and painstakingly derivative that even Capcom diehards should stay away. Capcom made the fighting genre what it is today, but this game is yet another blemish on Capcom's rapidly declining record. If you really feel the need to see Chun-Li dressed up as a cheerleader, then this game is right up your alley. But then perhaps a psychiatric evaluation would be time better spent. Amusingly, along with its appearances in the living room and the arcade, the game would also go on to appear on the very Japanese handheld gaming device known as the WonderSwan. But we may look at this version of the game in more detail in the future. Despite this game's confusing existence, at first glance the game sold relatively well in Japan, with Pocket Fighter serving as the country's 9th most popular game of the year in the arcade in 1997. So whilst the title was certainly no huge hit, the game found an audience. In the West, on the other hand, many people were as confused as GameSpot about this game's existence, including myself prior to making this video. After a lot of unravelling, it becomes clear pretty quickly why this game did manage to find an audience in Japan, especially when we consider the genius behind the release of Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo. The game worked in Japan due to being released with the right history and context behind the parody. But living in a part of the world that never received chibi Gundam capsule toys or published super deformed parody fan fiction, all of this just looks totally random and nonsensical. Pocket Fighter is the Street Fighter game that was simply too Japanese. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed today's content covering this very Japanese subject. If you are new here, make sure you like, subscribe and hit that notification bell to ensure that you never miss one of my upcoming videos. I cover the history of different fighting games every week on this channel, so let me know down in the comments which fighter you would like me to look at next. This video topic, along with many others, are chosen by the great people who back this channel over on Patreon. Your backing allows me to do what I do on a full-time basis. So as usual, a huge thank you goes out for allowing me to do what I do. Shout outs go out to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, A Murder of Crows, Heo Paulo Lopez, Joseph Raznick, Doug Perkins, Corey Imarsh Sr., Lou Johnson, BXL Gotham, Brian Dinsht, Evan Border, Philip Manth, Cambo Rambo 82, Azrael Warakai, Keith Ferguson, Joaquin Varela, Prince Knight, Michael Cullix, Ago, Jordan Durant, TOG Driver, Angel Light 85, Alethea Swanson, Timothy W. Haskins II, Nick Daniels, Princess Anna, Carlos Domingos, Glenny Glenn, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Sponge Matt B, Gary Pinkett, EC Professor, Aaron McNamara, Instant Gratification Monkey, Man Shovel, James Bishop, JB, Posty XL, Michael Hall, Wesley Sangahe, Ted Stickles, Langston Miller, Noob, Brian Barry, Sir Lagny, Stephen Lewis, Sarah Powell, Vlamik Renee, Sarai H. Al Sarai, Marvin Araliga, Chris Cool, Adrian Hannington, Bernard NG, Richard Stu Stewart, James McDonald, Crazy Yarl, Dan Van Dammit, Adam Castin, Gregory Smoradiewicz, Lewis Viant, John Bates, David Bow, Chris Fisk, Paul Elliott, Mean Machine Dean, Mike Bruno, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Hans Christian, Craig Jenkins, Tom Elliott, RetroVersion.com, KC Wright, Since Spaces, Zai, Andrew Bazansky, and all of my other patrons. Thank you so much for allowing me to do what I do. I love you long time.